When I was growing into my leaning toward the tropics, it was the custom among sound scientists to inveigh against the having of what they spoke of as adventures in the field. Adventures on an expedition were a sure mark of incompetence, they said, or of chicanery, and there was something in it too. In those days, a regular rash of restless people of both sexes was dashing about the tropics, cooking up sensational situations to write about and claiming to be doing it for the sake of science. It was only natural for honest men to bemoan such antics, but saying it was adventure that was the harm was nonsense. The thing is, as you may know, but I had not discovered then, adventure is just a state of mind, and a very pleasant one, and no harm to anybody, and a great asset if you use it right. The process of saving wilderness has two nominally separate aspects: prevention of the extinction of species and maintenance of wild landscapes. To some extent, the two are the same thing. Obviously, if the whole living place of an animal is kept intact, the animal will automatically be preserved. Conversely, the degradation of habitat endangers the survival of all of its occupants, with the jeopardy proportional to the degree of specialization of the species involved. One of the subsidiary obstacles in saving swamps is simple-minded prejudice. A principal cause of this is the black water that some swamps have. People who have known wild water only in a mountain trout stream or a Minnesota lake usually recoil when they see the black water of a bayhead or cypress swamp. In a field course in ecology that I teach, we go to several such places every year, and each time we stop at our first blackwater stream, somebody says how dirty the water is and instantly gets jumped on by others to whom swamp water is lovely, potable stuff, in which red-breasted brim, red-finned pike, otters, and wood ducks abide. One way to relieve that particular prejudice is to make the biased person stick his face down into the water and suck up a nice long drink of it. He won't want to do this, perhaps, and he may not be immediately carried away with the taste of the drink either, because it is just weak leaf tea, really without lemon or sugar. But the astounding harmlessness of the draught is bound to be a salutary revelation. Since childhood, I have drunk black water whenever I got thirsty in the swamp, providing the place was far from the haunts of man. And while I am no physical paragon, I have no ailments that could possibly be laid to drinking black swamp water. You can point out that swamps store water, filter and purify water, and impede the dangerous rush of water, that they are refuges for endangered wildlife, and that they are laboratories for the teaching and research necessary for the advancement of environmental technology. But once you have assigned the corresponding dollar values and added them up, you will still hardly have begun to assess the total value of the asset. The total worth of wild landscape is not just the sum of different separate values, because these interact and augment each other in endless ways. And in any case, there remains unitemized the absolutely incalculable practical value of wild green spaces left intact where mistakes we don't even know we have made can later be corrected. Besides all that, the dwindling horde of places such as Four Hole Swamp are, in another, more intangible but nonetheless vital way, a strategic resource. They sustain the nostalgia for unruined nature that has got to be kept alive if we are to keep on struggling against the destruction of the world or the turning of it into a termite mound.
The sciences weren't my strongest subjects at the University of Florida. I'd taken the basic required courses as a freshman and sophomore. When I got to be a junior, in order to be eligible for Phi Beta Kappa, you had to take one course beyond each of the basic required freshman and sophomore courses in each area. So that meant that I had to pick a science course. Well, I picked Archie's course in evolution, and it was a tremendous personal experience. Not only did I learn something about the theory of evolution and genetics and how we came to be, but I also learned something about a master teacher. Archie had a classroom full of people who weren't the greatest science students at the university, and yet he was able to make the subject come alive. He was able to put it in the context that non-science students could appreciate and could learn something of the scientific method. It also exposed me to a unique human being, a person who was a deeply committed scientist, but went beyond being a scientist to being a disciple for those values that he thought were important. Archie's legacy to us is a rich one. It essentially is that he cared. He understood Florida. He had studied Florida as a scientist, but his commitment went beyond an intellectual one to an emotional commitment to preserve what was best of the stuff of our state.
Simple-minded people will sometimes tell you that because extinction is natural, we ought not bother about the whooping crane. Why should we be concerned with endangered species, you'll hear, when most of the species that ever lived are extinct? There is, of course, no similarity between the obsolescence that accompanies long-term evolutionary competition or environmental change and the dismal kinds of extinction perpetrated by modern man. Natural extinction is a necessary result of the flow of biological time. The natural progression of geology, climate, and evolution, which causes well-adapted creatures of one period to go out of style and either die out or change into something else in the next. The process is an orderly and inevitable one, not a blot on the record of civilized man, as the disappearance of the whooping cranes would be. In Florida these days, you can still hear, under the mindless, glad din over industry coming in, the voices of the old ones, grieving over the passing of the wilderness. They are no longer watching landscapes wasting away. That happened long ago. What is going on now is just a lot of little cleanup operations, little scratchings out of small tag ends and patches of the past, overlooked in the first waves of ruin. Outboard motors are washing the water plants clear out of the spring runs. The last evergreen hammocks are falling in chopped-out confusion. The airboats are cornering the wildest sulphur belly frogs in the farthest coves of Bonnet Marsh. You knew the lovely bay would one day buzz with kickers and the beaches be littered with people in their leavings and the sunsets be dulled by neon. Among the first things to go would be the old crocodile in her hole too near the highway, and everywhere the fish would grow scarce or cynical. Even the ancient silvered logs of mahogany and princewood would be snaked off to some cabinet shops, and the gem-like tree snails snatched from Jamaica dogwood limbs in the dim hammocks. The lay and figure of the islands would not change. The indigo of the Gulf Stream would always lap the eastern rim of the arc, and inside it would confine the incredible spectrum of the bay, and its hot marl waters swirled and banded with every shade from turquoise to green and milky jade. The 1,000 little mangrove-bordered islets would be there, and the big black niggerhead sponges, and new vast jewfish would move in to take the places of the ones the fishermen horsed out among the piling at the old ferry slip.
Dr. Carr, even though he was a trained biologist and a very good one, also an old-fashioned generalist. And it seems to me that he had that perspective on existence, which is really vital and critical to truly understanding the philosophy of conservation. I think that people who see it in the large, it's not fashionable among certain schools of scientists. It's perfectly true. They tend to be rather narrow and focused on their own discipline and on their own subject. And I think they miss the whole picture, and the whole picture is vastly important, especially to people like Dr. Carr, who were interested in communicating that to people at large, because he knows that there's no sense studying if you have nothing to study. He's very interested in transmitting that education to the public. I feel exactly the same way. I think it's a very important place for generalists, and even though it's not a fashionable scientific posture anymore. I can't quarrel with anything Dr. Carr says in terms of the conservation problems and history in Florida. Well, looking out over Payne's Prairie, it's very easy to see how Dr. Carr was reminded of Africa, because there are many places in Africa where you have this sort of situation, in Ngorongoro Crater and many other places, where you're looking down on a savanna as if you're looking into a whole other world set back thousands and millions of years. Especially when you have the water over here with large crocodilians in it, alligators in this case, but nonetheless closely related creatures. So there are many parallels here in terms of savanna and grasslands, and the fact that we have wiped out the large mammalian fauna on our savanna makes the vision of the African savanna all the more poignant, and makes us, in a sense, mourn, although that's not what Dr. Carr did, but nonetheless we do mourn for what we've lost here, and for the great animals that once walked in this very place where we're looking at now.
I want to speak on behalf of snakes. I live in snake country, and I have always liked snakes and have kept them steadily on my mind. People who resent snakes explain their attitude by saying that some snakes are venomous, but there is more to the hang-up than that, a lot more. I am not suggesting that anybody take asps playfully to their bosom, or wrestle anacondas, or even walk heedlessly through a palmetto flatwoods in Florida. But the United States is blessed with a great diversity of harmless snakes. Besides being ecologically useful, they are artistically decorated, richly colored, and consummately athletic beings that really ought to be appreciated more. They ought to be watched. People watch birds regularly nowadays, but you rarely come upon anybody watching snakes. That is a great shame, because snake watching, though a more demanding exercise than bird watching, can be every bit as rewarding. A bird watcher is helped by the singing of the objects of his search. Snakes never sing. Some of the most arresting snake behavior is related to the feeding. Watching is sometimes not for the overtly impressionable person, simply because the diets of snakes tend to be heavy in whole, live, vertebrate animals. So, if you take the second grade out on a field trip and come upon a milk snake engulfing a mouse or a bullfrog screaming heartrendingly because a garter snake has hold of his leg, some calming apologia may be in order. You may explain that snakes having no hands, only prickly teeth, very detensable jaws, and a liking for extremely fresh food, eat mainly whole live animals. It is simply their custom, you can say, and not much worse, is it really, than a man eating a raw oyster or dropping a lobster into a pot of hot water. If an aspirant snake watcher has trouble getting out in the open country, he can find a lot of gratification watching well-adjusted captive snakes. Not captive in the sense of caged, but domesticated, living unrestrained in the house with the dog and children. Every kind of snake is not appropriate for this kind of relationship. And best of all, in my opinion, is the indigo snake. The indigo is handsome and extroverted and, for some ironic reason, a natural-born friend to man. Actually, the indigo snake is becoming dangerously rare throughout most of its range, and a person probably ought to go to jail for catching one. While keeping snakes in homes and zoos is fun, it does not discharge our obligation to save them as wild species in the world around us. A snake is the elegant product of 100 million years of natural selection. The decline of snakes in our changing world has gone almost unmonitored. It is 2 years now since I last saw an indigo snake cross the dirt road I drive home on, and I take this as a straw in the burdened wind of the times. Others have spoken for cranes and whales, and I hasten to say these words in praise of snakes, whose silent spring is also far along. A formerly magnificent example of magnolia, laurel oak, hammock near Gainesville, big enough for 2 or 3 Boy Scouts to get lost in every year, is called San Falasco, or simply Big Hammock. This used to be a famous hunting ground. Selective cutting has been done there for decades with slowly growing intensity. Some of the best magnolias were cut into sections for butcher's blocks. Big dogwoods were sawn into billets to make shuttles for English textile mills. People took out little dogwoods, redbuds, and fringe trees to plant in their yards. And recently, more disastrous cutting has been done for pulp and crating mills. But with it all, San Falasco has never been completely ruined. It is big and wild, and enough old crooked or hollow trees are left to keep some of the original magic of the forest landscape. Repeatedly, efforts have been made to save what remains, but because the place is so obviously not virgin, it fails to qualify for the usual kinds of sanctuary funds. If something is not done soon, San Falasco seems sure to go into bean crates, pulpwood, and suburbs for Gainesville and Alachua. But for the time being, it is still enchanted, and a great many people go out there just to be in a quiet green place. On my own last visit, I stopped at the edge of a chain of steep-walled lime sinks that cut out across the midsection of the hammock, I sat on a log to savor the rare silence of a place a mile out into green woodland from its nearest edge. It was a spot where there was a chance to see an otter, or a pair of wood ducks in a little swamp at the bottom of the valley, or even a woodcock staring one-eyed without bolting off among the tree trunks. But instead, this time, almost at once, I heard a queer, low, growing rumble in the west, and before I could account for the noise, it exploded in my face, and 3 boys on motorcycles roared by not 30 feet from the log I sat on. When the incredible riot had passed, I got up and walked over to where the motorcycles had gone by and found a little clean trail there, not more than a foot wide, and worn down deep into the hammock floor. It was a motorbike road through the middle of San Velasco. And I stood there beside it for quite a while, thinking of the spread of beach buggies, airboats, and snowmobiles, and how strangely our values get mixed up in these changing times of ours. Spanish moss is the most influential plant in the southeastern landscape, the most widespread, and by all odds, the most distinctive. A big old live oak tree without its moss looks like a bishop in his underwear. Lord only knows how a whole live oak hammock would look if its moss should disappear. Spanish moss hanging in trees has a subtle, changing look that painters of landscape find hard to capture. On clear days, when the moss is dry, there is something about the gradient of light and density in the pendant clumps that eludes both the brush and the pencil. Not being able myself to draw anything, I can't tell what the trouble is, but the attempts at realistic delineation that I see are all too stiff or fuzzy or dense or in some other ways distressing, while the freer gropings for the spirit of the moss make it seem like a thing the artist has not known long and lovingly enough. The trouble is both texture and illumination. The festoons fall in soft tapers that are opaque gray above and thin out into translucent spikes below, and much of the time the moss is in motion. The light tips make thin wind gauges that dance out downwind in moving air. To a wise eye, these tell the speed and direction of the wind more accurately than dancing leaves or swaying branches do. I have a friend who likes to fish off Cedar Key, 60 miles away on the Gulf Coast. It doesn't take much of a wind to ruin a fishing trip out there, so no matter what the weather report has been, before leaving home, my friend looks out of his window and studies the movements of the moss. If only the feathery tips are dancing, he gets ready for the 60-mile drive to the coast. But if the swing starts up in the tops of the clumps, he knows that the wind on the Gulf may run stronger than the predicted 15 knots, and he thinks of other things to do that day.
When I first saw marine turtles at the London Zoo, I wanted to find out more about them. So I went to the writings of Archie Carr, and the more I found out, the more the mystery deepened and the more magical was the navigation of these marine turtles that Carr writes about so carefully and so movingly. The marvelous thing about Archie Carr's writing is that while giving carefully observed information and data, it refreshes and intensifies one's sense of mystery, which is, after all, why I write. Once I became interested in the sea turtles, I went to the writings of Archie Carr, and the more information I found, the more mysterious and fascinating they became. So, certainly, the spirit of Archie Carr pervades my book and my effort in finding out about turtles. There is a kind of mystique in any animal that navigates. There is a mystique in the echolocation of dolphins and bats. There is a mystique in the navigation of the Arctic tern and the homing pigeon. There's a mystique in the navigation of the green turtle. The idea that an animal can be programmed to find what a human unaided could never find it's magical. And now that I have some information about it, it doesn't become less magical.
People nowadays often speak of a quality of life that our land must provide if the future is to be worth living in. I have not heard the phrase defined very clearly, but I hope the quality they mean is a self-perpetuating harmony with the magnificent remnants that have survived the long, long journey through the mists of time. But the saving of wild beings from obliteration cannot be expected to pay for itself in more than a sprinkling of cases. For most of the wild things on earth, the future must depend upon the conscience of mankind.